What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Modern video, and today we're going to be looking at one of the most consistent performing Modern decks in like the last probably about year and a half. In the black-green Yawgmoth deck, we're going to be going over what exactly makes it so consistent, and even with a revolving door of, bannings, shaking up the format, and new decks just kind of finding some tech and some different combos and making their way to the top of the metagame, that this deck always finds itself in those like top 3, top 4 decks of the format, even for the longest time being one of the second most played deck of all the other decks in the Modern format, which is pretty impressive to kind of hold that spot and even just hold the top 3 spot for as long as Yawgmoth has. But before we get too deep into the deck list itself, if you like the content that you see here and you want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. We do a lot of Modern, Pioneer, and longer form content here, so again, if any of that stuff interests you, consider subscribing to the channel, ring the notification bell so you know when those videos are uploaded. And if you go into the description down below, you will see a link to my Discord server as well as a link to the deck list. You can go and join the Discord server there. Of course, check out the deck list, play it for yourself, and see how you like black-green Yawgmoth. I don't think it's really any secret to the people that have been around my channel for a while. This is like one of my favorite Modern decks to play of all time. While I'm very nostalgic for like the Death Shadow deck, I really love like these creature combo decks, and Yawgmoth is definitely no exception to that, and is probably the creature combo deck of like the 2020s. So without further ado, let's kind of get into it. So, black-green Yawgmoth, the namesake card, Yawgmoth, is definitely your engine and a vital piece in trying to win the game. So, it's 2 generic, 2 black for 2/4. Protection from humans is a legendary creature that says you can pay 1 life and sacrifice another creature to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card. It also has another ability that says you can pay 2 black and discard a card to proliferate. So with this card, you're trying to combine it with creatures that essentially you don't care if they die. And while there's like one route when it says when this creature dies, you do X, this deck opts to go for something like Yawgmoth with the Undying mechanic, which says whenever a creature dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, you return to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. And that is super important because of how counters interact with each other in Magic. So if you have a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, and say you use Yawgmoth to put a -1/-1 counter on it, it simultaneously, for a brief moment, has a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter on it. And then how Magic ends up working is that those counters end up canceling out, which means that it doesn't have either of those counters on it anymore. Meaning that if you have a Yawgmoth, it comes into play, it has a +1/+1 counter on it. You put a -1/-1 counter on it, and as long as putting that -1/-1 counter on it doesn't die, for example, if a Yawgmoth has 1 damage on it, the counters will remove from the Yawgmoth, and it'll just be, back to a 1/1. Then you could sacrifice the Yawgmoth, it'll come back with a +1/+1 counter, and so on. So that's kind of the idea of like what we're trying to do with this deck. Is we're here to play like Yawgmoth, we're here to play something like a Stringroot Geist. Where the same idea is that we're going to try to put -1/-1 counters on them when they have +1/+1 counters on them to kind of reset those creatures and then sacrifice them to get more value, draw more cards, put -1/-1 counters on other things, and then eventually get to the point where we can get either, 2 creatures that have the Undying mechanic or 1 creature with the Undying mechanic and a Hapatra. Because Hapatra will make a snake every time that a creature has 1 or more -1/-1 counters put on it, which shenanigans can ensue if you have multiple creatures with -1/-1 counters on them and you proliferate with Yawgmoth. So with these cards, you can essentially have an infinite way of like sacking and kind of looping these creatures. So like with Hapatra, you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, you make a snake, you bring Yawgmoth back, whatever. You sacrifice the snake, put a -1/-1 counter on Yawgmoth. It gets that -1/-1 counter put on, even though it'll never technically see it other than when state-based actions are checked, and you'll end up getting a snake. And then you can sacrifice the Yawgmoth, put a -1/-1 counter on the snake. The snake will die from the counter. The Yawgmoth comes back with a +1/+1 counter on it, and then you get a snake because there was a creature that got a -1/-1 counter put on it. So you can bounce these back and forth and draw essentially equal to your life total. Now, what exactly are we playing to? Well, we're playing to something like Zulaport Cutthroat. There's something like Blood Artist that you'll see in a lot of other lists. There is kind of a, there is edge cases where both of them are really good. But when you're kind of going through this combo where you're like sacking your creatures back and forth, it really doesn't matter for the most part. So Zulaport Cutthroat says when it or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So when you're sacrificing these creatures, you're paying a life to activate Yawgmoth's ability. You're putting a -1/-1 counter on a creature. You sack the creature that you have, so you're going to also get a Zulaport Cutthroat trigger, which means that you're going to gain that life back, and then your opponent's going to lose the life, and then your creature's going to come back, and you just continue this loop until your opponent loses all their life. So a key difference between Zulaport Cutthroat and Blood Artist. Blood Artist will trigger on any creature that dies, but it has to target an opponent, or it has to target a player, whereas Zulaport Cutthroat gets around like the protection of like the One Ring and things like that. And that's kind of like the big thing I think people are kind of like gravitating towards, where they're playing more Cutthroat and less Blood Artist. Personally, I like playing Blood Artist because, again, like when triggering on other people's creatures dying is really good and is a very powerful kind of piece to play with when you're just kind of like sacking your creatures to get value, draw cards, and you're trying to look to set up, or, you know, you can like kind of attack your opponent's board in this way as well. Zulaport Cutthroat will also drain your opponent for a ton of damage as well. If you have something like Hepatra in play and you're playing against something like any of the creature decks in the format, because you're going to get to like sack your creature, you know, paying a life, you know, you're going to drain them, you're going to get counter, you're going to get snake back, and you can just blow up your opponent's whole board essentially with that, and, you know, drain them in the process and probably even attack and win the game. So those are like the main pieces that we're looking at in this deck. But we wouldn't be like this creature toolbox deck if, you know, we weren't playing Quarter Calling for 1, and for 2, we didn't have some pretty neat targets as well. So you see something like main deck Haywire Might, which is just something that's going to be very useful, especially in a world where people are playing a lot of the Scion of Draco Leyline of the Guild Pact like combo. And this is like a way that you can kill the Leyline, then it opens up their Scion of Dracos, and then we kind of go into that part where we're talking about like Yawgmoth plus Hepatra just to like shotgun your opponent's whole board and get rid of it. You're going to be up on a ton of cards. Of course, having to be careful necessarily in that matchup because like Tribal Flames and things like that. But, you know, aside from that, you're going to be able to kill like all of their creatures. You have something like an Orcish Bowmaster to punish people that are playing like the One Ring and all these different cantrips and everything like that. So you get your incremental value, you're going to deal damage, you're going to get a pretty big Orc army token. That's notably going to have +1/+1 counters on it, and we'll get to why that's going to be important here in a minute. You have things like Dryad Arbor that you can fetch up with your lands that, you know, essentially kind of tap for mana on the turn they come in if you're casting like a Chord of Calling. Also gives you like a surprise like Yawgmoth like redraw if you absolutely need that. And of course is going to come up later, you know, when we talk about the new addition to the deck. You know, 4 Delighted Halfling is going to make your Yawgmoth and by extension your Shieldred, which is like another tutor target, uncounterable. You have an Endurance for the graveyard decks. Wall of Roots is just going to add a ton of mana, especially in conjunction with something like Chord of Calling. You have a Scavenging Ooze, again, probably for more of the other graveyard decks, and another creature that's going to be able to put +1/+1 counters on itself, which is also really neat. Grist, we went over, is like a creature in every zone except for the battlefield. So, you know, you can eat this with like a Scavenging Ooze, and you actually get counters on it. Or you can eat it with Agatha's Soul's Cauldron, which is then going to make all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters on them Grist the Hunger Tides. All those other creatures are also going to be Scavenging Oozes. They're going to be Haywire Mites, Gilded Gooses, Delighted Halflings, Dryad Arbors. You know, they're going to have these activated abilities on them. And even Yawgmoths, this gives you like other copies of Yawgmoth if your opponent answers this one, or if it gets milled off a Grist, what have you. And you just get to kind of always have access to a Yawgmoth. And Agatha's Soul's Cauldron gives +1/+1 counters to all those creatures, so you have to tap it and exile a target card from a graveyard, and if it's a creature card, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. You can spend mana as though mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control, and creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on all activated abilities of all creatures exiled with Agatha's Soul's Cauldron. So this is like a way that you can get additional copies of all these creatures and just absolutely go ham on your opponent. And there's some neat combos, if you will, in the sideboard as well to kind of look at. Some things that you would see from other deck lists. You'd see like Walking Ballista, where you can sacrifice a wolf that has no counters on it to put a +1/+1 counter on it. you draw a card from Yawgmoth, and then you remove that counter to shoot your opponent if you have eaten the Walking Ballista, and then you get sack it again, bring back the counter, and then end up dealing like 1 damage to your opponent. It's essentially like a roundabout way of doing like the Zulaport Cutthroat trick, but works out the same. If you have in combination with Shieldred, you're going to pay a life and then do your thing, draw a card, and then you're going to gain 2 life, so you're going to net life. Kind of in that way. There's also people that use the other card that, of course, I cannot think of, Spike Feeder, where you can, sack it, you put the counter on it, and then you remove the counter to gain 2 life, because that's one of the abilities of Spike Feeder, when you essentially get to do the same thing, where it's like a self-contained, you never have to target anything, you just remove the counter, gain 2 life, then you sack it, and draw a card, bring it back with the counter, and just kind of get to keep looping until you find everything that you need to absolutely try to win the game or disrupt your opponent. The land base, pretty simple. You have Blooming Marshes, you have 2 Beseiju, which is going to help you with the Leyline of the Guild Pact. This has been something that's always been playing, but definitely seems more important now than ever. You have 6 fetch lands and 4 Verdant Catacombs, 2 Misty Rainforest. You have 2 Overgrown Tombs to get. You have a Swamp. You have a Twilight Mire to kind of filter and give you double black, double green when you need it. Underground Mortuary is the green-black Surveil land that we see from Murders of Karlov Manor. Kind of usurping, if that's how you want to pronounce it and the way you want to call it, Colony Garden, where Colony Garden would kind of give you like a token to put into play, and then it would help with like Cord. It was like another thing to sack to like Yawgmoth, but it seems like players are gravitating more towards the Underground Mortuary over the Colony Garden. We have Takenuma as like a way that we can kind of get back, Gris, Yawgmoth, any one of our other like one-ofs and stuff that we end up milling. Pendelhaven is like a way that we can protect some of our creatures as well, mainly something like an Orcish Bowmaster. We can protect like a Yawgmoth this way. Haywire Mites can get protected, Dryad Arbors, things like that. While it doesn't seem like it'll be relevant, but there's been a lot of times where like Pendelhaven has come in clutch to not only protect our creature, but to also kind of like get in extra points of damage from time to time as well, and like those situations where you kind of have like the anemic beats going. The sideboard, I said that there were some other cool like kind of targets, things you can do with like Soul's Cauldron and things like that. Fulminator Mage is like the big one that people usually play. Sometimes it's in the main deck, sometimes it is in the sideboard. This player opted to put it in the sideboard. You sacrifice to destroy target non-basic land. You're essentially able to put +1/+1 counters like on your tokens and things like that. And then, if you have like, say a creature that has counters on them, you can kind of do some shenanigans with that. And then finally, when you're finished, you can just start sacking them to Fulminator Mage, or as Fulminator Mage's ability to then destroy non-basic lands and then just set them back to the Stone Age while you're holding on to a bunch of cards in hand after kind of doing your loop, and then just like blowing up your board to blow up their hopes and dreams. Some other creatures, you have a Reclamation Sage that you can go and get with like Court of Calling. Force of Vigor is another card that's going to be really good against something like the Guild Pact. Even though you're not going to be able to force, both of their pieces, you're going to be able to at least hit one of them with Force of Vigor, which is pretty good in my book. You have more Endurances in the sideboard, Soulless Jailer. You have Legion's End for some of the other Rhinos players that might still be kicking around. Thoughtseizes for like the combo decks. Pick Your Poison is another card that can go and hit your opponent's Leyline of the Guild Pacts, make them sacrifice an artifact, so then they end up having to sacrifice Scion of Draco, which is also going to get rid of like what they have going on. And even if they don't, it makes them sacrifice a creature with flying, which a lot of the other zoo decks and things like that, and just other decks in general, typically don't have. So like Pick Your Poison, maybe against something like the blue, like decks that are playing like Murktide and things like that, and like have Dragon Rage Channeler or whatever in conjunction with the with your Scion of Draco. You can just have them sacrifice an artifact. Chances are they're just going to have to sacrifice it to the Scion to it. And if you're playing something like the Zoo deck, you can just choose to have them sacrifice a creature for flying. They're going to have to get rid of it. And then lastly, a Fatal Push as well for a little bit of removal against some of the other pesky creature decks, a la the Zoo decks and stuff. And that is Yawgmoth for the modern format. This deck is always kicks around. It's always doing great. It's just a very powerful deck. From out of nowhere, you get a Yawgmoth and you just have a few dorks in play. You can just assemble some pretty decent draws. Like, as long as you don't draw all lands, really, you end up having a lot of like ability to kind of run away with the game. Even like the first Yawgmoth, if you resolve your first Yawgmoth and it doesn't like win the game, that's totally fine, because your first Yawgmoth doesn't have to win the game. You know, it can just end up creating a ton of value, like refilling your hand. And if your opponent kills it, you know, like, oh, well, whatever. You know, I'm pretty much set up to kind of try it again, but this time having more mana to play more things and to just kind of get more to the board and that, and again, try to set up a win that way. So this deck is always awesome. I love playing it. It has so many different intricate lines and things that you can try and do, and it just blows my mind like how good this deck has been and how consistently good it's been like all this time. And really only in the last like 6 months, I would say, people have been really picking up and playing it like super hardcore, and it's been great to see. It's great to see a deck like this kind of existing in the modern format. So let me know what y'all think of the Black Green Yawgmoth deck down below in the comments. If there's any other modern decks that you would like to see me kind of feature on the channel as well, be sure to leave them in the comments down below. Message me on Discord, anything like that. Of course, remember to subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell if you want to see more videos like this and other Pioneer and longer form content. And of course, check out the deck list down below in the description, as well as the Discord server. So that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all in the next one.